The origins and rise of Paris. Long before it became the capital of France, the area around modern-day Paris had been inhabited for nearly 10,000 years. But the roots of the city itself trace back to a Celtic tribe known as the Parisii, who settled along the banks of the Seine River between 250 and 225 BC. Originally called Lucca, the small settlement's strategic position allowed the Parisii to build bridges and fortifications, controlling key trade routes between northern Europe and the Mediterranean. Prosperity followed, enough for them to mint their own gold coins. But wealth also attracted attention. In the 50s BC, the Roman Republic launched its campaign to conquer Gaul, modern-day France. In 52 BC, the Romans clashed with the Parisii and their allies in the Battle of Lutetia, eventually defeating them. In the aftermath, they founded the Roman city of Lutetia Parisiorum on the left bank of the Seine. The new city followed Roman planning. A north-south axis, a bustling forum with a temple and basilica, and even an enormous amphitheater built in the 1st century AD, capable of seating 15,000 people, nearly twice the town's population of 8,000. As the 3rd century wore on, the Roman Empire faltered under pressure from migrating barbarian tribes. In Lutetia, people fled from the vulnerable left bank to the safer Al-Dalas site, the island in the river's center. Abandoned Roman monuments were torn down, their stones repurposed to build the city's first defensive wall. By 305 AD, the city was being referred to as Civitas Parisiorum, the city of the Parisii. Within a century, the name evolved to simply Paris. In the 5th century, the decline of the Western Roman Empire brought new threats. The Huns, Franks, and other barbarian groups attacked, but legend credits the city's survival to Saint Genevieve, who rallied the citizens and led the defenses. She would become the patron saint of Paris. By the end of the 5th century, the Franks, under Clovis I, had taken control of northern Gaul. Clovis made Paris a symbolically important city, and eventually, it became the capital of the Frankish kingdom. But under the later Carolingian dynasty, which rose to power in 751, Paris's political influence waned. It became a provincial city, overshadowed by other royal centers. A turning point came in 987 with the rise of the Capetian dynasty. Though the early Capetians controlled only the region around Paris, their power steadily grew, and so did the city's importance. Paris re-emerged as the cultural, commercial, political, and religious heart of France. During the Middle Ages, the city's identity solidified. The Al-Dalas site housed the royal palace, where the Palais de Justice now stands. The left bank became a hub of religion and learning, home to great abbeys like Saint-Germain-des-Prés and Saint Genevieve. In 1150, the University of Paris was founded, drawing scholars from across Europe. Meanwhile, the right bank blossomed into a commercial powerhouse, filled with bustling markets, ports, workshops, and merchant houses. By the end of the 12th century, the city's population and economy demanded stronger defenses. King Philip II responded by building a massive stone wall around both banks of the Seine, completed in 1213, along with towers and fortified gates. Philip also ordered the paving of the city's muddy streets and constructed the Louvre fortress on the northern edge, a future symbol of royal power. Paris, from plague to power. Between 1356 and 1383, under the reign of King Charles V, Paris underwent major transformation. A new and more expansive city wall was constructed, and a mighty fortress, the Bastille, was erected on the eastern edge of the city. But while the skyline changed, daily life for most Parisians remained the same, defined by rigid social hierarchies. At the base of society were the poor, laborers, peasants, beggars, and lepers. Above them stood the craftsmen, skilled workers who owned their tools and organized into guilds that protected their trade and jobs. Then came the merchants and bankers, just 15% of the population, but essential to the city's economy and growth. The clergy held significant influence, forming a group similar in size, including university students. Their structured hierarchy allowed the most talented among them to rise in status. At the top were the hereditary nobility, many of whom served in the royal court. Paris's booming population quickly led to overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. The Black Death arrived in 1348, claiming nearly 50,000 lives. For centuries, plague outbreaks recurred. Disease wasn't the only threat, violence was widespread. Between 55% to 80% of major crimes were murders, often triggered by petty disputes. After returning to French control, Paris entered a period of renewal. By 1500, the population soared to 250,000. Under King Francis I, the city blossomed with Renaissance architecture, bridges, fountains, and the first version of the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall. Francis also turned Paris into a center of learning. In 1531, he founded a new university faculty teaching Hebrew, Greek, and mathematics. By the late 1500s, over 75 printing presses made Paris the leading city for book publishing in Europe. But prosperity gave way to chaos. From 1562 to 1598, the French Wars of Religion plunged Paris into turmoil. On August 23, 1572, thousands of Protestants were in the city for the royal wedding of the future King Henry IV. That night, the royal council ordered the assassination of Protestant leaders. Violence erupted. Over the following weeks, Catholic mobs slaughtered thousands of Protestants in what became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Around 3,000 died in Paris alone, and the killings spread across the country. By the early 1600s, Paris was still reeling. A third of its population had fled. Buildings lay in ruin. Major projects like the Louvre and the Hôtel de Ville were left unfinished. King Henry IV began rebuilding efforts, commissioning new landmarks such as Place Dauphine and Pont Neuf, the first bridge in Paris built without houses. But in 1610, his progress was cut short when he was assassinated by a religious fanatic. Despite the loss, the city continued to evolve. His widow, Marie de' Medici, built the Luxembourg Palace in 1615. His son, Louis XIII, and Cardinal Richelieu worked to establish Paris as Europe's cultural capital. They introduced Roman-inspired architecture, built 5 new bridges over the Seine, and launched institutions like the Louvre Gallery, Académie Française, and the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. When Louis XIII died in 1643, his son Louis XIV, just a child, took the throne. Political unrest followed. A rebellion by Parisian nobles raged until 1653. Scarred by the uprising, Louis XIV developed a distrust of the city and moved the royal court to Versailles in 1671. At the dawn of the 18th century, Paris continued its steady expansion. The Champs-Élysées was laid out, stretching from the Tuileries Garden to the Seine, forming a key part of the city's grand axial design. Despite the architectural marvels constructed during the previous century, much of Paris remained a cramped maze of dirty, winding streets filled with overcrowded buildings. For most Parisians, daily life had not changed significantly since medieval times. Yet, new ideas were beginning to stir. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau frequented the city's cafes, which had become vital hubs for exchanging news, debating philosophy, and disseminating revolutionary ideas. By 1789, the loyalty of many Parisians to the monarchy was eroding, particularly due to King Louis XVI's economic mismanagement and repeated tax hikes. That summer, the dismissal of a popular finance minister sparked protests that escalated into riots, igniting the French Revolution. Paris became the epicenter of this historic upheaval, transitioning from an absolute monarchy to a republic through waves of violence, destruction, and political change. The revolution reached its symbolic climax on January 21, 1793, with the execution of King Louis XVI by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. Chaos and instability reigned throughout the 1790s until a young general, Napoleon Bonaparte, seized power in a coup d'état in November 1799, establishing the consulate and naming himself first consul. Under Napoleon, Paris began to recover from revolutionary turmoil. Though he crowned himself emperor in 1804 and spent much of his reign at war, he invested in Paris's transformation into a capital worthy of imperial grandeur. He commissioned new bridges over the Seine, built monuments such as the column in Place Vendôme and the Arc de Triomphe, and oversaw major urban improvements. Following Napoleon's defeat in 1815, Allied forces briefly occupied Paris, ushering in the Bourbon Restoration under King Louis XVIII. Ruling as a constitutional monarch, he was succeeded by his brother Charles X in 1824. Charles's increasingly authoritarian rule culminated in the July Revolution of 1830. Days of intense street fighting forced Charles to abdicate, and Louis Philippe, the citizen king, was installed as a new constitutional monarch. His reign saw industrial growth, the construction of Paris's first railway stations, and the population approaching 1 million, though poverty and inequality remained widespread. Napoleon III launched an ambitious urban renewal campaign led by Baron Georges Haussmann. Their goals were to combat unemployment and modernize Paris with better sanitation, wider streets, more light, and open spaces. Haussmann expanded the city's boundaries, creating the 20 arrondissements we know today. He introduced wide boulevards, uniform building facades of creamy white stone, and new infrastructure including gas lighting for large parks and the Grand Palais Garnier Opera House. Paris flourished as a hub of industry and global finance. However, Napoleon III's reign ended in disaster. He was defeated at the Battle of Sedan during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, captured, and forced to abdicate. Paris, besieged by Prussian forces, endured a brutal winter of starvation and bombardment. Following the city's surrender in January 1871, the radical Paris Commune briefly took control. Lasting only 2 months, the Commune was violently suppressed by government forces, resulting in thousands of deaths and widespread devastation. Paris blossomed as the center of modern art. Impressionist pioneers like Edouard Manet and Claude Monet gave way to creative titans such as Renoir, Picasso, Toulouse-Lautrec, and Matisse. But as the 20th century began, Paris, like all of Europe, was forever altered by the First World War. In 1914, German forces nearly encircled the city, but the offensive was halted at the First Battle of the Marne, aided in part by the famed taxis of the Marne transporting troops to the front. Though spared occupation, Paris endured bombings, Zeppelin raids, and long-range shelling during the war. The post-war years brought economic hardship, but the 1920s saw a cultural revival. Artists, writers, and musicians, including Ernest Hemingway, Igor Stravinsky, and James Joyce, flocked to the city. Jazz thrived, and Paris's small but vibrant black community made its mark on the cultural scene. By the 1930s, deepening political divisions and economic woes created fertile ground for extremism. After Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939, France declared war. Despite evacuation efforts and defensive preparations, German forces bypassed defenses and entered Paris unopposed in June 1940. The city became the administrative center of the German occupation in France. Parisians endured rationing, repression, and humiliation. The Jewish population suffered the most, with more than 12,000 Parisian Jews deported to extermination camps. Paris was finally liberated in August 1944 as Allied troops were welcomed by jubilant crowds. In the post-war decades, the city was rebuilt. Immigration from former colonies reshaped its demographic and cultural fabric. Urban renewal projects restored civic life, and by the 1980s, Paris had reclaimed its reputation as a global capital of art, fashion, and culture. Despite enduring centuries of plague, revolution, war, and hardship, Paris continually rose from the ashes, reinventing itself while preserving its rich legacy. Today, it stands not only as one of the most beautiful cities in the world, but also as a symbol of human resilience, creativity, and enduring spirit.